The tent was 8 feet wide and made of canvas so thin that the desert stars showed through it like pinpricks of light. Inside, a man was dying. His name was Daniel Reyes. He was 38 years old, a former Army infantryman from San Antonio, Texas, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart he kept in a shoebox under his bed because he couldn't look at it. He was lying on his back on a wool blanket, his chest barely moving, his lips the colour of old ash. The man sitting beside him didn't call 911. He didn't know what to tell them. He wasn't sure in that moment whether what was happening was medical or spiritual, and that confusion, that single hesitation, is the detail that explains everything that follows. Daniel had not taken a pill. He had not injected anything. He had not drunk anything at all. He had inhaled the vaporized venom of a toad. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always something to see people from across the world united by one story. The toad is called Bufo alvarius. It lives in the Sonoran Desert, that sprawling stretch of rock and heat that covers southern Arizona and northern Mexico. It is roughly the size of a man's fist. It has been on this continent for millions of years, and in the last decade, it has become the center of a crisis that nobody in power seems to want to name out loud. The venom this toad secretes, a milky white substance it produces from glands on its shoulders when threatened, contains a compound called 5-MeO-DMT. Researchers who study psychedelic compounds describe it as the most potent naturally occurring psychedelic substance known to science. Not the most famous, not the most widely used, the most potent by weight, by duration, by the sheer vertical drop of what it does to human consciousness. A dose the size of a match head, vaporized and inhaled, produces an experience so total that many people who survive it struggle to find words for it, and the ones who do almost always use the same one: death. In 2023, the US Food and Drug Administration received more adverse event reports connected to 5-MeO-DMT ceremonies than to any other unscheduled psychedelic substance in the country. That same year, a joint investigation by journalists in the United States and Mexico identified at least 19 deaths linked to toad venom ceremonies between 2019 and 2023. 19 confirmed. The actual number, the investigators noted, was likely much higher, because most of these events were never reported to anyone. Think about that number for a moment. 19 people dead from a substance most doctors have never heard of, in ceremonies taking place in tents, and rented houses and converted barns and 5-star wellness retreats, charging $3,000 a session. 19 people, and almost none of their deaths made the news. The retreat industry built around toad venom is now estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. It operates largely in Mexico, Costa Rica, the Netherlands, and increasingly in the United States, sometimes openly, sometimes in the language of church and religious sacrament, a legal shield that has so far proven remarkably durable. The people running these ceremonies range from indigenous healers with genuine cultural lineage to former real estate agents who watched a documentary in 2019 and bought a pipe. There is no licensing requirement. There is no standard dose. There is no background check. There is a website, a testimonial page, and a Venmo handle. Celebrities have endorsed it. Professional athletes have credited it with saving their careers. Veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder travel to Mexico because they read on a forum that one session did what 10 years of therapy couldn't. Some of them come back transformed. Some of them come back broken. Some of them don't come back at all. The toads themselves are being harvested at a pace that is collapsing their populations in certain parts of Sonora. A single adult toad produces roughly 1 gram of dried venom. A single ceremony typically uses between 50 and 80 milligrams. The math means each toad yields enough venom for roughly a dozen sessions, and the demand is not 12 sessions. It is thousands, every week, at dozens of facilities, with no quota and no enforcement. Herpetologists began documenting alarming population gaps in Bufo alvarius colonies along the Arizona-Sonora border as early as 2019. By 2022, some field researchers stopped finding the toads at sites where they had reliably appeared for decades. This is not a story about a drug that snuck up on the world. Every piece of this crisis was visible, documented, and flagged by someone: a researcher, a regulator, a journalist, a grieving family. The warnings existed. They were simply not heard. Or perhaps more precisely, they were heard. And the people with the most to lose from acting on them chose not to. Back in the tent in the Arizona desert in the fall of 2019, the man sitting beside Daniel Reyes finally made the call. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes later. Daniel's blood pressure was crashing. His oxygen saturation was low enough that the first responder would later describe it as incompatible with consciousness. He was airlifted to a hospital in Tucson. He survived. He would not be the last person carried out of a ceremony. He would not be the worst case that year, and the facility where it happened, a registered business, with a website and a satisfaction guarantee, would be operating again within a week. The question is not how a toad venom became a global psychedelic crisis. The question is who let it, and why, and what that answer reveals about the world that was waiting for something like this to arrive. Because Bufo alvarius did not come from nowhere. It came from the desert. But the crisis came from somewhere else entirely. Long before Daniel Reyes ever heard the word Bufo, long before the retreat centers and the podcasts and the $3,000 ceremonies, a herpetologist named Dr. Albert Gruber was kneeling in the mud at the edge of an irrigation ditch outside Tucson, Arizona, holding a flashlight in one hand and a specimen jar in the other, trying to understand why this particular toad was sweating. It was the summer of 1965. The ditch was fed by runoff from a nearby cotton farm. The toad, fat, olive brown, warty across the shoulders, had puffed itself up in response to being handled, and from the large glands behind its eyes, it was producing a substance that looked like condensed milk and smelled faintly of something chemical, something almost pharmaceutical. Gruber had handled hundreds of toads. He had never seen secretion like this. He put the substance in the jar. He labelled it with the date and a field number. He drove back to the University of Arizona campus with the windows down, because the smell lingered on his hands even through latex gloves. The analysis took 3 weeks. What came back from the lab was not what Gruber expected. The secretion contained a cocktail of compounds, but 2 dominated. The first was bufotenin, a compound already known to science, already flagged by researchers as potentially psychoactive, already the subject of a handful of deeply uncomfortable experiments conducted by US military-affiliated researchers in the 1950s on prisoners who had not fully consented. The second compound was different. It was structurally similar to DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a psychedelic that occurs naturally in dozens of plants and in trace amounts in the human brain itself, but it was not DMT. It had an extra oxygen atom in a specific position on the molecule. That single atom made it dramatically more potent, dramatically faster acting, and dramatically more difficult to predict. The compound was 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, 5-MeODMT. Gruber published a brief technical note about the finding in a herpetology journal. It ran 22 lines. It attracted no attention outside his field, because there was no reason it should. He had identified an unusual chemical in a desert toad's defensive secretion, full stop. He was not proposing that anyone use it. The idea wouldn't have occurred to him. That is the first layer of irony in this story. The man who first characterized the compound in Bufo alvarius did so with purely scientific curiosity and absolutely no understanding of what he had found. He was looking at chemistry. What he had actually found was a fuse. The fuse sat unlit for 18 years. In 1983, an 8-page pamphlet appeared in the American psychedelic underground. It was photocopied on a home machine, stapled in the top left corner, and mailed to a small list of perhaps a few hundred people. Researchers, psychedelic enthusiasts, members of organizations that operated in legal grey zones at the fringes of consciousness exploration. The pamphlet's title was direct: Bufo alvarius, the psychedelic toad of the Sonoran Desert. Its author used the pen name Albert Most. The pamphlet described in plain and practical language how to find Bufo alvarius in the wild, how to handle it without harming it, how to milk its venom glands by applying firm pressure, how to dry the resulting secretion on a glass plate, and how to vaporize and inhale the dried substance using a standard glass pipe. It noted that the experience lasted between 15 and 45 minutes. It noted that the effects were, in the author's words, overwhelming. It included no warnings. There were none in the scientific literature to draw from, because nobody had studied this in humans. Nobody had reason to. The pamphlet was not illegal to write. The toad was not illegal to possess. The compound it produced had not been scheduled by the DEA, which had not yet decided it needed to be. The whole transaction, the writing, the printing, the mailing, the reading, existed in a space that law had not yet thought to occupy. Albert Most's real identity remains disputed to this day. Some researchers believe he was a Tucson area veterinarian. Others point to a former chemistry professor. The pamphlet itself offers no clues. What it does offer is a set of instructions so specific and so replicable that anyone who followed them correctly would produce a genuine, reliably potent psychedelic experience with a toad. They caught themselves in a drainage ditch. For nearly a decade, almost nothing happened. The psychedelic underground of the 1980s was cautious in ways that are difficult to appreciate now. The crackdown following the 1970 Controlled Substances Act had driven serious researchers out of institutions and into hiding. The community that remained was small, careful, and deeply aware that visibility meant prosecution. A pamphlet about a desert toad circulated quietly. A few hundred people, maybe a few thousand, tried the venom over the course of the decade. Their experiences were intense enough that almost none of them talked about it openly. Not because it was unimpressive, but because what had happened to them during those 15 minutes felt too large, too strange, too private to translate into ordinary language. That silence was meaningful. It was a warning dressed as discretion. The science, meanwhile, continued to develop in isolation from everything happening in the desert. By the early 1990s, neurochemists had established that 5-MeO-DMT binds with extraordinary affinity to the 5-HT2A receptor, the same receptor targeted by LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline, but with a speed and intensity that dwarfed all of them. Where psilocybin eases into the receptor system over 30 to 60 minutes, 5-MeO-DMT arrives like a power surge, saturating the receptor sites almost instantaneously. The brain has no time to adapt. The normal filtering mechanisms that keep sensory experience manageable are overwhelmed simultaneously, all at once, within seconds of inhalation. 4 to 6 times more potent than DMT by weight. That figure appeared in a 1994 pharmacology paper and was noted, filed, and largely forgotten outside specialist circles. There was also the pre-Columbian question. Archaeologists working in Mesoamerican sites had been finding toad imagery in ritual context for decades. Carved stone toads, ceramic toad figures, toad motifs on ceremonial vessels. The interpretation was debated. Some researchers argued for genuine psychedelic ritual use going back thousands of years. Others pointed out that toads appear in Mesoamerican iconography for dozens of reasons: rain, fertility, the underworld, and that equating the image with the substance was a leap. The debate was never fully resolved. What the debate did, unintentionally, was provide future retreat operators with a narrative: ancient wisdom, sacred tradition, indigenous knowledge. The archaeological ambiguity allowed anyone selling ceremonies to wrap a modern practice in thousands of years of cultural authority that was, at minimum, contested, and at most, fabricated entirely. Gruber lived long enough to see what his specimen jar had set in motion. He died in 2009, at 71, at his home outside Tucson, having spent his final years studying tortoise habitat loss rather than toads. He had published 2 more brief notes on Bufo alvarius in his career, both purely herpetological. His colleagues remembered him as meticulous, quiet, and skeptical of dramatic claims. His original specimen jar, labelled in pencil, Field Sample 14B, July 1965, sat in a university storage room for 40 years before anyone thought to look for it. The pamphlet, meanwhile, was finding new readers. The internet had arrived. The photocopied 8 pages had been scanned and uploaded to early psychedelic forums, where they were available to anyone with a dial-up connection and a search query. The audience for Bufo alvarius, the psychedelic toad of the Sonoran Desert, was no longer a few hundred careful insiders. It was everyone, and someone, somewhere, was already reading it and thinking not about the chemistry, not about the pharmacology, not about the archaeologically contested ritual traditions, but about the business. The first people who tried the toad venom in any serious numbers were not thrill seekers. They were not teenagers at a party. They were, almost without exception, people who had already spent years inside the psychedelic underground. People who had taken LSD hundreds of times, who had drunk ayahuasca in the Amazon, who considered themselves experienced navigators of altered states. They were, by the standards of that world, the most prepared people imaginable. Most of them were not prepared. The reports that circulated through early internet forums in the late 1990s and early 2000s followed a pattern so consistent it became its own kind of warning. The experience did not feel like other psychedelics. It did not feel like an amplification of ordinary consciousness. It felt like the deletion of it. Users described losing all sense of body, self, time, and location within seconds of inhaling. Not a gradual dissolution, but an instantaneous one, as if a switch had been thrown and the person who'd been standing there simply ceased to exist. 15 minutes later they were back, lying on the floor sometimes, occasionally having wet themselves without awareness, staring at the ceiling with the specific expression of someone who has just been told something they cannot repeat. The word that appeared most often in these accounts was not euphoric. It was not pleasurable. The word was terrifying, and yet the same people came back. That is the first thing about 5-MeO-DMT that requires careful attention, because it doesn't follow the logic of recreational drug use. People don't repeatedly seek out experiences they describe as the worst terror of their lives, unless something about the aftermath makes the terror worth it. The reports described it consistently. A period following the experience, lasting days or sometimes weeks, during which the ordinary anxieties of life went quiet. Grief that had been sitting in the chest for years simply wasn't there. The hypervigilance, the intrusive thoughts, the constant low-level dread, absent, not suppressed. Absent in the way that a sound is absent rather than muffled. Nobody in the scientific community was paying close attention yet. The sample size was too small, the setting too illegal, the users too reluctant to walk into a university and describe what had happened to them. The data existed only in forum posts and word of mouth, which is to say, it existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Then a man named Octavio Rettig arrived. Rettig was a Mexican physician, trained, licensed, practicing in Hermosillo, the capital of Sonora State, which is the Toad's home territory. He encountered 5-MeO-DMT sometime around 2007 and became convinced, based on his own experiences and early observations, that it had significant potential as a treatment for addiction. He began offering ceremonies in the Sonoran Desert to people struggling with heroin and methamphetamine dependency. The setting was minimal: desert ground, a blanket, a pipe, a person trained in emergency medicine standing by. His reported outcomes were striking. Patients who had cycled through rehabilitation programs for years described losing their cravings after a single session. Some relapsed, some didn't. Rettig began documenting cases and presenting them informally to anyone who would listen. He was not operating a business in the conventional sense. He was operating a mission. The distinction mattered enormously for about 3 years, because what Rettig had created, whether he intended it or not, was a proof of concept, a template, a demonstration that you could bring people to the Sonoran Desert, administer toad venom, charge for the service, and frame the entire transaction as healing rather than drug use. The legal exposure was manageable. The demand, it turned out, was vast. International visitors began arriving in Sonora around 2010. Not many, dozens at first, then low hundreds. They came primarily from the United States and Western Europe, and they came specifically because the toad's venom was not scheduled in most jurisdictions, which meant that whatever happened in those desert ceremonies existed in a regulatory space that was, technically, nobody's jurisdiction at all. The first adverse event reports began surfacing around the same time. In 2011, a man participating in a ceremony in Sonora experienced a seizure during the acute phase of the experience. He survived. His facilitator, not Rettig, had not asked whether he was taking medication. He was in fact taking a common antidepressant from the SSRI class, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the family of drugs that includes Prozac and Zoloft. The combination of an SRI and a substance that floods the serotonin system with the force of 5-MeO-DMT creates a condition called serotonin syndrome. The body's serotonin receptors, already sensitized by the medication, receive a signal so overwhelming that the nervous system begins to malfunction. Muscles lock, temperature spikes. In severe cases, the heart loses its rhythm. The facilitator did not report the incident. The man recovered and told no one outside his immediate circle. The ceremony business that had hosted him continued operating. This was not an isolated failure of one bad actor. It was the establishment of a pattern, the first iteration of a loop that would repeat with increasing stakes for the next 12 years. Rettig's own trajectory grew complicated. He became a polarizing figure. His methods were intense. Videos that circulated online showed him performing what he described as physical interventions during ceremonies, holding participants in positions they had not consented to, pressing on their bodies as they convulsed through the experience. Some former participants praised him. Others described the experience as traumatic in ways that had nothing to do with the substance itself. The indigenous Seri people of Sonora, whose territorial lands overlap with Bufo alvarius habitat, publicly stated that the toad had no historical ceremonial role in their tradition, directly contradicting the ancient wisdom narrative that was already being attached to the practice. That statement was made in 2016. It was largely ignored by the retreat industry that had grown up around Rettig's model, because by 2016, that industry was no longer about Rettig. He had become irrelevant to the thing he had helped create. The template he had demonstrated, desert ceremony, healing narrative, international clientele, legal grey zone, had been copied, modified, scaled up, and moved indoors by dozens of operators who had never met him and had no medical training whatsoever. The ceremonies were now happening not just in Sonora, but in rented houses in Baja California, in converted hotels in Oaxaca, in private residences in California and Texas and New York, where the legal exposure was higher, but the clientele were richer and less willing to travel. The price point had also shifted. Rettig's early ceremonies had been essentially free or low cost, oriented toward addiction treatment. The new operators understood that the clients most willing to pay premium prices were not heroin addicts in Hermosillo. They were stressed executives in San Francisco, trauma survivors in New York, veterans in Texas who had cycled through VA programs for a decade without relief and were now willing to try anything. The price went up. $300, $800, $1,500, $3,000 for a weekend retreat with meals, a private room, and a facilitator with a website that used the words sacred and transformation in the same sentence. The venom supply could not keep pace with demand. Wild toads were being collected from drainage ditches, from roadside pools, from protected habitat areas in southern Arizona. A single collector could take dozens of animals in a night. The venom was milked, dried, and transported across the border in small quantities, easily enough to conceal, difficult enough to detect that enforcement was essentially non-existent. Daniel Reyes in San Antonio, Texas, knew none of this history. He didn't know about Rettig or the Siri people or the seizure in 2011. He had found a forum thread, sometime in 2016, written by a veteran who described his PTSD symptoms in language so precise and so familiar that Daniel had read it 3 times in a row. The post described 10 years of nightmares, hypervigilance, an inability to sit with his back to a door. It described how 2 sessions with toad venom had changed something in him that nothing else had touched. Daniel saved the thread. He didn't act on it immediately. He sat with it for 7 months, the way a person sits with a decision that frightens them almost as much as the alternative. What nobody on that forum had mentioned, what the veteran who wrote the post had not known to include, was that the facility he had used, the one that had apparently transformed him, had already received 2 complaints from other participants in the same year. The complaints had been filed with no agency, reported to no authority, and posted to a different forum that Daniel had never found. The question of what Daniel would have done had he found that second forum is unanswerable. What is answerable is what he did instead. He made a booking. He wired $800 to an account in Mexico. And he began counting the weeks until his appointment, the appointment that, depending on how the next session went, would either give him back the life the war had taken or cost him something he hadn't yet identified as being at risk. The house was outside Ensenada, 40 minutes from the border, set back from a dirt road behind a stand of dusty eucalyptus trees. It had a blue metal gate and a hand-painted sign that said, in English, Center for Inner Healing. The gate had a combination lock. Daniel Reyes typed in the 4-digit code he had received by email 3 days earlier, and it swung open. It was March 2017. He had driven himself from San Antonio, 14 hours, alone, with a bag containing 2 changes of clothes, a water bottle, and the printed intake form the centre had emailed him. A single page asking about allergies, previous psychedelic use, and whether he had a history of psychosis. There was no question about current medications. There was no question about heart conditions. The form had a signature line at the bottom, above the words, "I understand that this experience is entirely my responsibility." He had signed it in his kitchen the night before leaving, using the pen he kept next to the phone bill. There were 6 other participants that weekend. Daniel did not know their names by the end of it. What he knew was that one of them was a woman in her 50s from Los Angeles who ran a marketing firm. One was a young man who had driven down from Vancouver and mentioned, almost casually, that he had tried everything else. And one was a retired schoolteacher from Phoenix who brought a rosary and kept it wrapped around her left hand the entire time. 7 strangers in a rented house in Baja California, each carrying a weight that had not responded to the available treatments, each having wired money to a Mexican bank account to be here. The facilitator was a man named Marco. No last name offered, none requested. He was in his early 40s, calm, soft-spoken, with the specific, unhurried manner of someone who has spent years convincing other people to trust him. He had no medical degree. His qualifications, listed on the centre's website, were described as 10 years of ceremonial experience and training with indigenous teachers in Oaxaca. Nobody in that room had verified either claim. Nobody had known how. The ceremony began at dusk. Marco produced a glass pipe and a small glass vial containing a pale amber substance. The dried venom, powdered and measured. The dose he described as standard, approximately 75 milligrams. He had weighed it on a small digital scale, the kind sold in kitchen supply stores. He lit a butane torch rather than a lighter, explaining that the compound required a specific temperature to vaporize cleanly. He had done this hundreds of times. His hands did not shake. Daniel went third. He sat cross-legged on a folded blanket. He held the pipe to his lips when Marco told him to. He inhaled slowly and held the vapor in his lungs for as long as he could. Approximately 8 seconds, which is what Marco had instructed. Then he lay back. What happened next occupied approximately 14 minutes of clock time. To understand why anyone would pay money for this, and then come back for more, requires sitting with those 14 minutes carefully. The first sensation, documented across hundreds of independent accounts and now partially corroborated by neuroimaging studies conducted at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London, arrives within 5 to 10 seconds of inhalation. It is not visual. It is proprioceptive, a sudden, complete loss of any sense of where the body is in space. The floor disappears, not metaphorically. The signal that the nervous system uses to track the body's orientation against gravity simply stops arriving. Within 30 seconds, the visual field dissolves, not into darkness, but into something researchers describe as undifferentiated luminosity. There is no self to experience what is happening because the neural processes that construct the experience of selfhood have been temporarily overwhelmed. The default mode network, the brain's baseline system for self-referential thought, for the internal monologue, for the sense of being a continuous person with a past and a future, goes functionally offline, gone, for 14 minutes. What Daniel Reyes experienced during those 14 minutes is not something he could accurately report afterward, because the part of his brain that encodes experience into memory was not operating in any recognizable way. What he could report was what happened when it ended. He became aware of the ceiling first, a water-stained plaster ceiling with a single bulb in a wire cage fixture, then the blanket under his back, then the sound of someone else in the room breathing, then his own body incrementally, like a signal returning after interference, his hands, his chest rising and falling, the specific weight of his own skull against the folded blanket. He lay there for 20 minutes without moving, not because he was incapacitated, because there was nothing pressing enough to move for. The clinical term for what he experienced in the following days is a post-acute afterglow effect, and it is one of the most consistently reported and least understood phenomena associated with 5-MeO-DMT. Beginning within hours of the session, and persisting in Daniel's case for 19 days, It manifested as a dramatic reduction in the symptoms that had structured his life since his second deployment in 2011. The nightmares stopped, not tapered, stopped from the night of the ceremony. The hypervigilance, the constant background scanning of every room he entered for exits and threats and faces that didn't fit, quieted to a level he had not experienced since before he first shipped out. He slept 7 hours in a row for the first time in 6 years. He called his sister in Austin, something he had been avoiding for 8 months, and spoke to her for an hour without the conversation costing him anything. He ate breakfast at a table by a window. The window faced the street. He didn't move the chair. For a veteran with combat PTSD, eating breakfast at a table facing a window without repositioning himself to protect his back. That single detail is a clinical data point. It represents a change in threat assessment baseline that years of cognitive behavioral therapy and 3 different medications had not produced. Something in the neurochemical reset of those 14 minutes had done what a decade of conventional treatment had not. The science behind why is still incomplete, but the outline is becoming clearer. 5-MeO-DMT's saturation of the 5-HT2A receptors triggers a massive release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, a protein associated with neuroplasticity, with the brain's capacity to form new connections and revise old patterns. The effect is comparable to, but more intense than, the neuroplasticity windows produced by psilocybin and ketamine. The working hypothesis among the small number of researchers studying this is that the experience forces a kind of neurological reset, not by processing trauma, but by temporarily dismantling the neural architecture through which trauma is continuously experienced. What gets rebuilt in the hours and days following the session is not necessarily identical to what existed before. The hypothesis is compelling. The evidence base for it is, at this point, composed of a handful of small studies, several hundred documented case reports, and a great deal of cautious optimism from researchers who are very careful about how they phrase their caution. Here is what the evidence base does not yet contain: any randomized controlled trial, any standardized dosing protocol tested across a meaningful sample, any longitudinal study tracking outcomes beyond 3 months, any systematic screening protocol to identify who should not receive this compound under any circumstances. The research gap is not an accident of timing. Clinical trials require funding. Funding requires institutional support. Institutional support requires a compound to be either legal or operating under a specific research exemption. 5-MeO-DMT in 2017 was unscheduled in the United States, not illegal, not approved, simply unaddressed. That regulatory limbo meant it was also nearly impossible to study formally, because the DEA's process for granting research licenses for psychedelic compounds was labyrinthine and slow, and the agencies that distributed research funding did not prioritize substances being used in unlicensed ceremonies in Baja California. The science that could have answered the critical questions: who benefits, who is harmed, what dose is safe, what combinations are lethal, was not being conducted at the speed the practice was spreading. Marco, at the center outside Ensenada, was not aware of any of this literature. His understanding of the mechanism was ceremonial rather than pharmacological. He spoke of the toad's medicine as a teacher, as a force with its own intelligence, as something that gave each participant exactly what they needed. This framing was not cynical. He appeared to believe it entirely. It was also entirely disconnected from the reality that he was administering a potent serotonergic compound to strangers whose medical histories he had not reviewed, in a setting with no emergency equipment beyond a first aid kit he kept under the kitchen sink. Daniel drove back to San Antonio 3 days after the ceremony. He had not told his VA therapist where he was going. He had told his neighbor he was visiting family in El Paso, For 19 days the quiet held. On the 20th morning he woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of a car backfiring on the street below his apartment window. He was on his feet and pressed against the wall next to the bedroom door before he was fully conscious. His heart was running at what felt like 140 beats per minute. The palms of his hands were wet. 19 days. Then the wall came back. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time. The street outside was silent. The car was gone. The old architecture was still there. Every circuit of it, exactly where it had always been, waiting with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. He opened his laptop. He went back to the forum. He began looking for the next available booking at the centre outside Ensenada, and then, because he was thorough in the way that soldiers are trained to be thorough, he began looking for other centres, comparing prices, reading testimonials, trying to understand whether a second session would restore what 19 days had taken away. What he did not know, what he had no mechanism for knowing, was that the forum he was using to research his options was being actively monitored by at least 2 retreat operators who paid a small monthly fee to a marketing service that flagged forum threads with high engagement around relevant keywords. His thread had been flagged. He would receive a private message within 48 hours from a centre in Sonora offering a discounted rate for returning clients. The message would describe itself as a coincidence. It was not. In the spring of 2018, a paper appeared in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs that should have changed everything. It didn't. The study had been conducted by a team of researchers at the University of New Mexico, led by a psychopharmacologist named Dr. Elena Voss. She and her colleagues had spent 18 months collecting survey data from 362 people who reported having used 5 MEO-DMT in ceremonial or informal settings, not in clinical trials because no clinical trials existed, but in the kinds of ceremonies Daniel Reyes had attended, in rented houses and desert clearings and converted rooms in Baja California and Sonora. The participants were recruited through online forums, harm reduction networks, and word of mouth. Most of them had never spoken to a researcher before about what had happened to them. The results contained 2 findings that pulled in opposite directions with enough force to make the paper almost impossible to summarize cleanly. The first finding confirmed what the forum testimonials had been saying for years. The majority of respondents, roughly 79%, reported significant reductions in depression and anxiety symptoms following their most recent 5-MeO-DMT experience, with effects lasting weeks to months. Among participants who self-identified as trauma survivors, the number was even higher. The data aligned with the emerging understanding of the neuroplasticity mechanism, and several addiction medicine researchers who reviewed the paper called it the most compelling preliminary evidence yet for formal clinical investigation. The second finding occupied a single paragraph in the results section and a footnote in the conclusion. 7% of respondents reported a serious adverse psychological event following their session. Not during, after. In the days and weeks following the ceremony, they experienced episodes of dissociation, meaning a detachment from their own sense of reality so complete that they could not reliably distinguish their own thoughts from external events. Several reported what they described as the experience refusing to end, intrusive re-experiencing of the dissolution state while sober, triggered by sounds, by sudden movements, by falling asleep. 2% reported suicidal ideation in the 2 weeks following the ceremony. Not a history of suicidal ideation. New suicidal ideation, appearing for the first time after the session in people who had arrived seeking relief. The authors recommended urgent follow-up research. They recommended that ceremonial facilitators conduct basic psychological screening before administering the compound. They recommended in careful academic language that someone with actual regulatory authority examine whether the current absence of oversight was sustainable. Nobody in the retreat industry read academic journals. The paper circulated within a narrow community of researchers and harm reduction advocates, generated a modest number of citations in subsequent studies, and did not reach the people who needed it most. The operators, the facilitators, the clients reading forum testimonials and making bookings. There was also the medication problem, and it was worse than anyone in the industry acknowledged. 5-MeO-DMT is chemically incompatible, dangerously so, with a list of common medications that reads like a survey of what Americans are most frequently prescribed. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which approximately 1 in 8 American adults takes on a regular basis, dramatically increase the risk of serotonin syndrome when combined with the compound. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, prescribed for depression and anxiety, can convert a standard dose into a potentially lethal one by preventing the body from metabolizing the compound at normal speed, effectively turning a 15-minute experience into something that lasts hours with no ceiling on intensity. Lithium, prescribed for bipolar disorder, has been associated with seizures when combined with psychedelics that act on the 5-HT2A receptor. Beta blockers, common heart medications taken by tens of millions of people over 50, can mask the early physiological warning signs that something is going wrong, the racing pulse, the spiking blood pressure, until the situation is already critical. The intake form at the centre outside Ensenada had not asked about any of these. Neither did the intake forms at the majority of retreat centres operating in Mexico and Central America at the time, according to a review conducted by the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies in 2019. Of 47 centres surveyed, fewer than a third asked specifically about SSRI use. Fewer than 1 in 5 asked about cardiac medications. 11 of the 47 had no intake process at all beyond collecting payment. Daniel Reyes, when he received the private message offering a discounted rate at a centre in Sonora, did not know any of this. What he knew was that the 19 days of quiet had ended, that the nightmares were back with the specific viciousness of something that had been temporarily held at bay, and that the private message had arrived at the precise moment he was looking for a reason to book another session. He told himself he would do it once more and then decide. That is exactly what he had told himself the first time. He filled out the intake form for the Sonoran Centre online. It was 4 questions. The last one asked if he was currently taking any prescription medications. He was a low-dose antidepressant his VA doctor had prescribed 8 months earlier, one he'd been considering stopping anyway because he felt it was doing nothing. He stared at the question for a moment. Then he typed, "No." He was not lying to harm anyone. He was lying the way desperate people lie, by deciding that the obstacle between them and relief is not a legitimate obstacle, but an administrative inconvenience created by people who don't understand what he was going through. The session was scheduled for a Saturday in June 2018. He drove to Sonora on a Friday. The centre was more professional in appearance than the house outside Ensenada. It had a reception desk and a printed menu of services, and a man in the waiting area who turned out to be a retired firefighter from Seattle, with the same flat, careful eyes that Daniel associated with people who had seen things that hadn't processed yet. The facilitator introduced herself as Valentina, again no last name, and walked the group through what she called a preparation circle, a 90-minute session involving breathwork and intention setting that Daniel found difficult to take seriously, but participated in because he had driven 8 hours and paid $1,100 and intended to see it through. The ceremony began in the late afternoon. The room was dim. The dose was measured at the same scale Daniel had seen before, 75 milligrams, and Valentina handed him the pipe with the same calm efficiency Marco had demonstrated. He inhaled. He held it. He lay back. The first 30 seconds were familiar. The floor disappearing, the visual field dissolving, the self switching off. Then something different. A quality to the dissolution that had not been present the first time. Something that registered even without a functioning self to register it. Something that would resurface later in his memory as a sensation of tremendous pressure without location, of being compressed from every direction simultaneously. When he came back, 17 minutes later, by the clock on the wall, his first coherent perception was pain. A headache that felt like something behind his eyes was straining against the sockets. His hands, when he looked at them, were trembling in a way that he could not stop by willing them to stop. He sat up too quickly and the room inverted, not spun, inverted the ceiling briefly where the floor had been, and Valentina put a hand on his shoulder and told him to breathe slowly. He sat on the blanket for 40 minutes before he trusted his legs to carry him to the bathroom. The headache lasted 3 days. The tremor in his hands lasted 2. He drove back to San Antonio on Sunday, with the passenger window open the entire way because the moving air was the only thing that felt real. He waited for the afterglow, the quiet he had felt after Ensenada, the morning with the window, the phone call to his sister. It did not come. What came instead, beginning on the 4th day after the Sonoran session, was something new. Lying in bed in the early morning, not quite asleep and not quite awake, he would experience a sensation of falling into the dissolution state, the same instantaneous annihilation of self he had felt in the ceremony, arriving without warning, without the pipe, without anything he had done to invite it. It lasted only seconds before he snapped back, but it happened again the following morning, and the morning after that. The clinical term is a flashback, though researchers prefer the more precise language of spontaneous experiential recurrence, an involuntary reactivation of the perceptual and neurochemical conditions of the original experience. It is documented in a subset of users of several psychedelic compounds, most notably LSD, and it is associated with a broader condition called hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or HPPD. In 5-MeO-DMT users, the specific character of the recurrences tends to reflect the dissolution experience rather than the visual phenomena associated with other psychedelics, which means that instead of seeing traces or geometric patterns, the person is briefly losing their sense of being a self. Briefly, but repeatedly, and without control. Daniel didn't connect what was happening to him with the session. He connected it to his PTSD, assumed the VA medication had stopped working entirely, assumed the war had finally found a new route through his defenses. He made an appointment with his VA therapist for the following week. He didn't mention Mexico. He didn't mention the toad. He described the new symptoms carefully and listened as his therapist adjusted his medication dosage. What his therapist did not know, could not have known because Daniel said nothing, was that he had taken a serotonergic compound 3 weeks earlier, while on an SSRI had experienced a session significantly more intense than his first, and was now experiencing recurrent involuntary dissociative episodes that bore a specific and documented relationship to that combination. The adjusted medication did nothing for the recurrences. They continued for 6 weeks, then gradually diminished. By October 2018 they had stopped. Daniel told himself the worst was over. He began reading the forum again. The Voss study, meanwhile, had found its way to the desk of a policy analyst at the DEA's Diversion Control Division, the department responsible for identifying substances that might require scheduling. The analyst read the study, wrote a summary memo flagging the adverse event data, and forwarded it up the chain. The memo was received, logged, and placed in a queue. The DEA's scheduling process, from initial flagging to formal rulemaking, takes an average of 4 to 7 years. The ceremonies continued every weekend. In September 2019, Mike Tyson sat across from Joe Rogan on a podcast watched by millions of people and described smoking toad venom as the experience that had saved his life. He was specific about it. He described the dissolution of self, the return, the weeks of clarity afterward. He described a version of himself before the toad that he no longer recognized. Rage, self-destruction, a man he'd been unable to stop being through any other means. He was not promoting a product. He was not being paid by a retreat center. He was simply describing, in the plainest language he could find, what had happened to him. The episode was downloaded 11 million times in its first week. Within 48 hours of that episode's release, every measurable metric associated with the toad ceremony industry spiked. Web searches for Bufo alvarius ceremony increased by 900%. Forum registrations on the largest psychedelic discussion platform tripled. At least a dozen retreat centers reported being booked solid for the following 3 months within days of the episode airing. One operator in Sonora later told a journalist that he received more inquiries in the 72 hours after the podcast than in the previous 2 years combined. Tyson was not the cause of what followed. He was an accelerant dropped onto a fire that had been building for a decade. What the podcast did was compress a timeline that would have otherwise stretched across several more years of gradual growth into something that moved with the sudden, unmanageable speed of a viral moment. The industry that received this surge of attention was not ready for it. It had never been designed to be ready for anything. New operators appeared within months. People who had listened to the podcast, read a forum, purchased dried venom from one of the online suppliers that operated openly on the edge of legal grey space, and decided they were qualified to facilitate. The barrier to entry was a glass pipe, a digital scale, and a website. Some of these new facilitators genuinely believed in what they were doing. Some saw an opportunity and named it something else. The market did not distinguish between them, because the market had no mechanism for distinction. Prices fractured in both directions simultaneously. At the high end, a new tier of luxury retreats emerged. Full weekend experiences at boutique properties in the hills above Ensenada and in the colonial neighborhoods of Oaxaca City, with private rooms, organic meals, integration therapists on staff, and price tags between $4,000 and $8,000 per person. These operations hired designers to build their websites, photographers to document their spaces, and copywriters who understood that the word healing tested better than the word psychedelic with their target demographic. At the low end, ceremonies were happening in apartments. Daniel Reyes found the low end. By late 2019, he had attended 4 sessions total. Ensenada in 2017, Sonora in 2018, and 2 more at a facility in Tijuana that operated out of a converted warehouse near the airport. The Tijuana operation charged $350 per session and ran groups of up to 15 people simultaneously, which meant the facilitator, a man named Rodrigo who had learned the practice from a YouTube series, was monitoring 15 people in simultaneous acute psychedelic states with the help of a single assistant. The afterglow from each successive session was shorter than the one before. After Ensenada, 19 days. After Sonora, nothing resembling the first experience, only the dissociative recurrences. After the first Tijuana session, 4 days of moderate relief. After the second, 2 days and a new development, a low, constant agitation in the week following the session that Daniel did not have language for, but that felt like the opposite of relief. He booked a 5th session anyway. This is the point at which the academic literature becomes relevant in a way that nobody in that Tijuana warehouse was aware of. A 2019 paper published in Psychopharmacology Not the Voss survey, but a separate study, smaller, more clinical, examined the neurochemical patterns of repeated 5-MeO-DMT exposure in animal models. The finding was not conclusive, but it was directional. Repeated saturation of the 5-HT2A receptor system appeared to produce a measurable downregulation, a reduction in the receptor's sensitivity, that required increasing doses to achieve equivalent effects. The receptor was adapting, protecting itself by becoming less responsive. This is, in pharmacological terms, the beginning of tolerance. Tolerance to a psychedelic is not the same as physical addiction. There is no withdrawal syndrome, no physical dependence in the way that opioids or alcohol create physical dependence. But behavioral patterns that are functionally indistinguishable from addiction can emerge when a person begins escalating frequency and dose to recapture an effect that is becoming less accessible. The person is not chasing euphoria. They are chasing the absence of pain. The distinction matters medically. In practice, from the outside, it looks the same. Daniel's VA therapist noticed the change in October 2019. The specific detail she recorded in her clinical notes that would not be subpoenaed or reviewed for another 4 years, was that Daniel arrived to his appointment wearing the same shirt he had worn the previous week, something he had never done before. He was precise about his appearance, always had been, the way some veterans carry military habits into civilian life as the last structure holding. The shirt was not dirty. It was simply the same shirt. She noted it and said nothing. Meanwhile, the toad was disappearing. Field researchers working in the Sonoran Desert had been tracking Bufo alvarius populations since the 1980s, primarily for baseline ecological data rather than any concern about harvest pressure. Beginning in 2018, a herpetologist named Dr. Patricia Ochoa at the Universidad de Sonora began noticing something in her annual survey data that she initially attributed to drought conditions, a sharp decline in adult toad numbers at sites she'd been monitoring for 11 years. The juveniles were still present, the eggs were still hatching, but the adults, the animals large enough to produce harvestable quantities of venom, were disappearing from sites where they had reliably appeared for over a decade. Ochoa published a preliminary data note in a Mexican ecology journal in early 2020. She did not use the word crisis. She described the trend as concerning and called for increased monitoring at known population sites across the Sonoran Desert on both sides of the border. The response from wildlife authorities was measured. Monitoring was discussed. A working group was proposed. The working group did not meet for 14 months because of the pandemic. The venom collectors did not stop during the pandemic. The ceremonies did not stop. They moved online briefly. There were improbably facilitators attempting to ship dried venom through the postal system and guide clients through sessions via Zoom, and then resumed in person as restrictions lifted, serving a population whose anxiety, isolation, and untreated trauma had been compounded by 18 months of a global health crisis. Demand in 2021 was higher than it had ever been. The supply chain adapted. This is where the story shifts in a direction that almost nobody in the participant community saw coming. Synthetic 5-MeO-DMT had existed in chemistry laboratories since the 1960s. It was not a new compound or a novel synthesis. The molecule is not complex, and its production does not require exotic precursors. By 2019, chemical manufacturers in China were producing it in kilogram quantities and shipping it internationally under a variety of labeling arrangements that exploited gaps in import controls. The compound was not scheduled in China until 2021. During those 2 years it moved freely. Retreat operators began using it. Not all of them, but enough that by 2022, researchers attempting to collect biological samples from ceremony participants for pharmacological analysis found an unexpectedly high proportion of synthetic compound in the data. A study conducted at a harm reduction organisation in the Netherlands tested samples collected from participants at 43 different ceremony settings across Mexico and Europe in 2022. The result? In 31% of ceremonies marketed explicitly as Bufo alvarius toad medicine, the substance administered was entirely synthetic. In another 18%, the substance was a mixture of natural venom and synthetic compound. 49% of participants at those 43 sites had paid for a toad ceremony and received something else entirely, without being told. The implications were not purely philosophical. Natural toad venom contains multiple compounds alongside 5-MeO-DMT, bufotenin, several other alkaloids, trace bufadienolides, which are cardiac active compounds found in all toad venoms. The combined effect of these compounds may differ from synthetic 5-MeO-DMT alone in ways that are not yet characterized. More critically, the potency of synthetic 5-MeO-DMT is extremely consistent, meaning a dose measured at 75 mg is exactly 75 mg every time. Natural venom varies significantly in compound concentration depending on the toad's age, health, season, and collection method. A facilitator who had calibrated their dosing protocol around natural venom and switched to synthetic without adjusting the dose was administering a meaningfully stronger experience than their participants expected. Several facilitators made this switch without telling anyone. Several of their participants had very bad sessions. Daniel Reyes attended his 5th ceremony in November 2019, 3 weeks before the tent in the Arizona desert where this story began. He drove to the Tijuana warehouse on a Thursday evening. He paid Rodrigo in cash, $350, folded in his jacket pocket. He had not eaten since the previous afternoon, following Rodrigo's preparation protocol. He had not taken his VA medication for 5 days. He had learned from the forum that the interaction risk was real and had stopped the medication without telling his VA doctor. What Rodrigo was using at the warehouse by November 2019 was no longer natural venom. He had switched to synthetic compound 2 months earlier, sourced from a supplier in Guangzhou, because the natural venom supply had become inconsistent and expensive. He had not adjusted his dose calibration. He had not told his participants. The pipe held 75 mg, the same as always, in his telling, but the compound in the pipe was not the same as always. Daniel inhaled at approximately 9 in the evening. At 9:14, Rodrigo's assistant, a 22-year-old named Sergio who had been doing this work for 6 weeks, noticed that Daniel's breathing had changed character. Not stopped. Changed. A specific pattern. Shallow. Irregular. With intervals between breaths that were longer than they should be. Sergio did not have the medical vocabulary to name what he was seeing. What he was seeing was the early signature of respiratory depression, the central nervous system reducing the automatic drive to breathe, a known risk of extremely high-intensity serotonergic events. Sergio shook Rodrigo's arm. Rodrigo looked at Daniel for 4 seconds. Then he told Sergio to watch him and moved to the other side of the room to attend to a different participant who was vocalizing loudly. Daniel's breathing stabilized on its own. 12 minutes later, when the acute phase ended and his nervous system began its return to baseline, he sat up eventually. He felt the specific emptiness he'd come to associate with sessions that didn't work the way the first one had. Not the quiet of Ensenada, but the absence of anything, like a room with the furniture removed and nothing put back. He drove back to San Antonio early the next morning. He was scheduled for his next session 2 weeks later at a new facility he had found through a recommendation on the forum, a tent encampment in the Arizona desert, operating under the description of a private spiritual retreat. He was going back. Whatever was waiting for him there, he was going back. The wellness industry has a specific talent for making financial relationships invisible. By 2020, the toad ceremony ecosystem had developed an economic architecture sophisticated enough that almost nobody participating in it, as a client, as a facilitator, even as an enthusiastic endorser, could see the whole structure from where they stood. It had the appearance of a grassroots healing movement. Underneath, it had the skeleton of an investment network. Here is how it worked. At the center of the structure were approximately a dozen mid to large retreat operators, mostly based in Mexico, with a combined annual revenue estimated by a 2022 financial analysis at somewhere between $80 and $120 million. These operators did not compete with each other in any meaningful sense. They cross-referred clients, shared facilitator talent, and in several documented cases shared investors. The investment came from a specific stratum of American and European venture capital that had identified psychedelic wellness as an emerging asset class, a term used without irony in at least 3 pitch decks that would later surface in court filings. Connected to the retreat operators were the documentarians. Between 2018 and 2022, at least 9 documentary films or streaming series featuring toad ceremonies were produced and distributed, ranging from short-form YouTube content to feature-length productions that screened at festivals and landed on major platforms. The films varied enormously in quality and tone, but were remarkably consistent in one respect. None of them disclosed the financial relationships between their production companies and the retreat centers they filmed. In at least 4 cases, the retreat centers featured in the films had provided funding, accommodation, and access in exchange for arrangements that were described in private emails, later obtained through litigation, as promotional partnerships. The films were not advertisements in any legal sense. They functioned as advertisements in every practical sense. Then there were the podcasters, the Instagram healers, the micro-influencers in the wellness space who posted about their transformative toad experiences to audiences of 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 followers. Some had been gifted free sessions by retreat operators in exchange for coverage. Some had equity arrangements with retreat-affiliated supplement companies selling integration products, herbs, adaptogens, breathing protocols, designed to be used alongside toad ceremonies. The financial disclosures in these posts, where they existed at all, typically appeared as a small font footnote below paragraphs of testimonial that described the toad as the most important thing that had ever happened to them. The people writing those posts often believed every word. That is what made it effective. The scientific community was not immune to the structure either. A 2020 study from a Johns Hopkins research team examined 5 MEO-DMT's effects on depression and anxiety in a sample of 42 participants and found significant lasting improvements in both measures. The study was rigorous by the standards of early-phase psychedelic research. Its lead author was careful in his conclusions, noting repeatedly that larger trials were needed before any clinical recommendations could be made. The paper was reported in at least 60 media outlets within a week of publication. Almost every headline dropped the caveats. What was not reported, what would not emerge until a whistleblower contacted a journalist 2 years later, was the existence of a second data set. The follow-up to the Johns Hopkins study was never published. It was conducted by a separate research team at the same institution, examining a larger cohort of 117 participants over a 6-month follow-up period, attempting to characterize adverse outcomes with more statistical power than the Voss survey had managed. The results, completed in late 2021, found that 12% of participants experienced lasting psychological disturbance, persistent depersonalization, dissociative episodes, or symptoms that met clinical criteria for a psychotic episode at some point in the 6 months following their session. One participant required involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. The study was not published. The lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Naomi Hartley, described what happened next in a recorded conversation with the journalist. The funding for the follow-up phase was withdrawn before the manuscript reached peer review. The funder was a private foundation with documented financial ties to 3 of the retreat operators featured in the 2020 documentary that had used the original Hopkins study as a centerpiece of its narrative. Hartley submitted the manuscript to 2 journals independently, using departmental funds. Both journals' editorial processes stalled at the review stage for periods she described as anomalous, one reaching 14 months without a decision, far outside normal processing times. She filed the manuscript in a university repository as a preprint, which made it technically public and practically invisible. Preprints are not peer-reviewed. They carry no institutional endorsement. In a media environment that preferentially covers published studies with clean positive findings, a preprint with complicated adverse event data generates almost no coverage. The retreat industry continued citing the 2020 Hopkins study on its websites. None of them cited the preprint. This is the mechanism, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a room full of people planning harm, but a set of financial incentives so consistently aligned that suppression happened through inertia, through the quiet withdrawal of funding, through editorial delay, through the gap between what gets published and what gets covered. Each individual decision was defensible. The cumulative effect was a scientific literature that, by 2022, substantially overrepresented positive outcomes and substantially underrepresented harm. The Mexican government layer was more direct. Internal communications obtained by a Mexican investigative news outlet in 2023 revealed that the Sonoran State Tourism Ministry had been receiving reports of serious adverse events at retreat centers in its jurisdiction since at least 2017. The reports came from hospital emergency departments, patients presenting with serotonin syndrome, acute psychosis, cardiac arrhythmia, and in 2 cases, injuries sustained during the acute phase of the experience when facilitators had physically restrained participants in ways that caused fractures. The emergency department staff had flagged the cases to public health authorities. The public health reports had been forwarded to the tourism ministry. The tourism ministry had classified the information. The rationale, described in an internal memo dated March 2018, was explicit. Psychedelic wellness tourism was projected to generate $240 million in revenue for Sonora State by 2025, and the release of adverse event data would compromise the regulatory environment that allowed the sector to operate. The memo recommended that incidents be handled at the facility level wherever possible, and that hospital reporting protocols be revised to de-emphasize the ceremonial context of psychedelic-related admissions. The revision happened. Admissions related to toad ceremonies began appearing in hospital records under broader diagnostic categories: cardiac event, acute psychiatric episode, drug intoxication unspecified, that made them statistically invisible as a category. The deaths did not appear in any category. Between 2017 and 2022, the Sonoran State Coroner's Office recorded 11 deaths that were, according to the subsequent ProPublica investigation, directly attributable to 5 MEO-DMT ceremonies. None of them were classified as ceremony-related in official records. The causes of death listed range from cardiac arrest to respiratory failure to accidental drowning. One participant had lost consciousness near a decorative fountain at a retreat property. The facilitators present at each of these events were not investigated. Most continued operating. The 11 deaths in official Sonoran records were not the complete picture. They represented the cases that reached hospitals or were otherwise documented. Researchers conducting the ProPublica investigation identified an additional 8 probable deaths through a combination of family interviews, forum records, and medical examiner reports from US hospitals where patients had been transported after ceremonies. 8 more cases where the connection to toad venom was documented in someone's records but never appeared in any official tally. 19 deaths. A floor, not a ceiling. Daniel Reyes, moving through this landscape with no awareness of any of its structural features, had by early 2020 become a characteristic data point in the harm profile that the suppressed Hartley study would have described if anyone had read it. His sessions were now occurring approximately every 3 to 4 weeks. Each one cost money he was increasingly not spending on other things. His truck had a cracked windshield he'd been meaning to fix for 4 months, a detail his sister noticed when she visited in January 2020 and mentioned to him, and which he dismissed with a flatness that she would describe later as unlike him. He had stopped attending his VA therapy appointments in November 2019, not because he had decided to stop, but because the appointments were on Thursdays and he was usually tired on Thursdays. His facilitator at the Arizona tent operation, the one where he'd been found unresponsive in the fall of 2019 and airlifted to Tucson, had been a man named Trevor Adkins, 44, a former personal trainer from Scottsdale who had attended a retreat in Costa Rica in 2018 and returned convinced that the toad was the most important healing tool in the world and that he was called to offer it. Adkins had not been prosecuted for what happened to Daniel. No charges were filed. The tent operation resumed. Adkins upgraded his website in December 2019, adding a testimonials page and a sliding scale payment option. Daniel did not go back to Adkins. The forum had warned him, in a thread that appeared 3 weeks after his hospitalization, that the Arizona operation had a pattern of over-sedation events. The thread had 11 replies. The 11th reply was from someone who said they had reported the facility to the Arizona Department of Health. The Department of Health had no regulatory category for toad venom ceremonies. The complaint was logged under a general wellness facility code and assigned to a queue with a 14-month processing backlog. Daniel found a new facility in Tijuana, different from Rodrigo's warehouse. It had a website with professional photographs and a testimonial section that mentioned veterans specifically. The intake form was longer than any he had seen before. 2 pages asking about medications, cardiac history, psychiatric history, trauma history. He filled it out carefully and completely, this time listing his VA medication honestly, because the form stated that full disclosure was required for safety, and that certain medications required a washout period before the session. The washout period the form specified was 5 days. His VA doctor had not recommended stopping the medication. He stopped it anyway, 5 days before the session, because the form said to, and because he wanted the session to work. The science on what a 5-day SSRI washout actually achieves, in terms of reducing serotonin syndrome risk, is not encouraging. The half-life of fluoxetine, the specific SSRI Daniel had been prescribed, is 4 to 6 days for the drug itself, and the active metabolite persists in the system for 1 to 2 weeks. A 5-day washout of fluoxetine is pharmacologically insufficient. The compound is still present at clinically significant levels. The interaction risk is not meaningfully reduced. The form had been written by someone who had read about washout periods on a forum and did not have the pharmacological background to understand that the number they had chosen was wrong. The session proceeded. What happened in that Tijuana facility in March 2020, 3 weeks into a global pandemic that had emptied the border crossing of its usual traffic and left the streets outside the building quieter than Daniel had ever heard them? What happened there would not surface publicly for 3 more years, when a journalist knocked on his sister's door in Austin and asked if she had a few minutes to talk about her brother. She did. She'd been waiting for someone to ask. Her name was Sofia Almeida, and she was 26 years old, and she had never heard of Bufo alvarius before a co-worker mentioned it at a dinner party in Mexico City in the spring of 2023. The co-worker was not a reckless person. She was a graphic designer, mid-30s, careful and considered, who had attended a retreat the previous year and described the experience as the most clarifying thing that had ever happened to her. She had been struggling with anxiety severe enough that she had taken medical leave from work twice in 3 years. After the ceremony, she had not. She spoke about it quietly, without evangelism, the way people speak about things that feel too private to oversell. Sophia had been struggling too. Not with anxiety in the clinical sense, with grief. Her father had died 14 months earlier from pancreatic cancer, a 4-month illness that had moved so fast there had been no time to prepare and no adequate aftermath. She had returned to work after 2 weeks. She had not cried at the funeral because she had been the one managing the arrangements, and by the time the arrangements were done, the acute grief had calcified into something she couldn't access or release. She slept badly. She had no appetite for things that had previously interested her. Her doctor had prescribed a mild anxiolytic, not an antidepressant, not an SSRI, a benzodiazepine taken as needed. She took it twice a week on average. The retreat her co-worker recommended was in Tepoztlán, a small, famously spiritual town in the mountains of Morelos State, 2 hours from Mexico City, close enough to be a weekend trip. The facility was called Centro Quetzal. It had a handsome website featuring photographs of the mountain view, a listed price of $2,200 for a 2-day experience, and a page of testimonials that included a retired federal judge, a well-known Mexican architect, and 3 people who described themselves as trauma survivors. The intake form was thorough. It asked about psychiatric history, cardiac history, family medical history, and current medications. Sophia listed the benzodiazepine honestly. The form's automated response flagged benzodiazepines as requiring facilitator review and generated an email from someone at the center named Luis, who wrote to say that occasional benzodiazepine use at low doses presented no contraindication for the ceremony, and that Sophia should simply refrain from taking it for 48 hours beforehand. Luis was not a doctor. His email stated that he had 12 years of ceremonial experience. His advice about benzodiazepines was drawn from a general harm reduction guide that had been written for recreational MDMA use and modified informally for toad ceremonies by a forum member in 2018. The pharmacology of benzodiazepines in relation to 5-MeO-DMT is complicated in a specific and important way. Benzodiazepines act on GABA receptors, a completely separate system from the serotonin receptors that 5-MeO-DMT engages. They are in fact the primary emergency treatment for serotonin syndrome and psychedelic-induced acute panic, because they dampen the nervous system's excitatory response. A person who takes benzodiazepines regularly and stops abruptly can experience a rebound excitatory state, heightened anxiety, elevated heart rate, increased neurological sensitivity that begins within 24 to 48 hours of discontinuation. Sophia, who had been taking a benzodiazepine twice a week for 8 months, stopped taking it 48 hours before her ceremony, exactly as Luis had instructed. She arrived in Tepoztlán on a Friday afternoon in September 2023. The mountains above the town were green from the summer rain. The air was cool enough that she wore a jacket on the walk from the parking area to the centre's main building. She felt, she had told her co-worker in a text message sent from the car, cautiously optimistic. Her co-worker had sent back a single word: good. There were 5 participants that weekend. The ceremony was scheduled for Saturday evening, following a day of preparation that included a guided meditation, a temazcal, a traditional sweat lodge ceremony, and a communal meal. The temazcal alone ran 3 hours in temperatures that several participants later described as extreme. One of the other participants, a man in his 50s from Guadalajara, had asked to leave the sweat lodge early and had been gently but persistently discouraged from doing so by the facilitator running it. He had stayed. He arrived at the evening meal visibly dehydrated, his lips dry and cracked at the corners. Dehydration elevates cardiac risk with 5-MeO-DMT. It is one of the documented contraindications in the harm reduction literature. The evening meal did not include adequate fluid replacement, and the ceremony began 2 hours later. Sophia's session lasted 18 minutes. By the 11th minute, the facilitator, a different person from Luis, a young woman named Carla who had been doing this work for 7 months, noticed that Sophia was making small, repetitive movements with her right hand, a fine tremor that was not the normal physical response to the acute phase. By the 14th minute, the tremor had become a sustained rigidity. Her right arm locked against her body, her fingers spread and immobile, her back arching slightly. Carla had been trained in what she called holding the space, which meant staying calm, maintaining a grounding physical presence, and trusting the medicine's process. She had not been trained to recognize the early signs of a seizure. She waited. Sophia's heart stopped at minute 17. The nearest hospital with emergency cardiac capabilities was 31 minutes from Tepoztlan by road. The centre had a defibrillator mounted on the wall near the entrance, purchased 6 months earlier following a minor cardiac event at a different facility that had generated brief discussion in the operator community. Nobody at the centre had been trained to use it. Carla had read the instructions on the packaging once. In the moment she could not find the packaging, a participant who had been a nurse 15 years earlier performed CPR for 19 minutes until the ambulance arrived. Sophia Almeida was pronounced dead at the hospital at 11:47 p.m. Her mother received the phone call at 2 a.m. in her apartment in Colonia Roma, Mexico City, from a facilitator who introduced himself as Luis and spoke to her in a voice so carefully measured and controlled that she would later describe it to investigators as the voice of someone who had made this call before and knew how to manage it. Luis had not made this call before, but the centre had legal counsel on retainer, and that counsel had provided specific guidance on what to say and what not to say when notifying next of kin. The guidance existed because Sophia was not the first person to be harmed at an affiliated facility. She was the first to die at this one. She was not the first to die at all. Sophia's mother, Graciela Almeida, was a secondary school history teacher. She did not have legal connections or media contacts or financial resources for a prolonged investigation. What she had was a daughter's phone, recovered from the centre, along with the rest of Sophia's belongings in a bag that was delivered to her apartment 3 days later, and on that phone was a documented trail, the co-worker's recommendation, the email from Luis, the text sent from the car, the intake form responses saved in Sophia's email drafts. A complete record of how her daughter had arrived at a facility that had sent her home in a bag. Graciela Almeida took the phone to a journalist at a Mexico City newspaper. The journalist had been pursuing a separate story about wellness tourism deaths for 7 months and had hit repeated walls. Families who wouldn't go on record, facilities that responded through lawyers, official records that categorized the deaths as cardiac events with no ceremonial context noted. Graciela went on record. She gave the journalist everything. The story published in October 2023 named Centro Quetzal, named Luis, named the financial network that connected the center to 4 others in Mexico and 2 in the United States. It reproduced the internal Sonoran State Tourism Ministry memo from 2018, the one classifying adverse event data to protect revenue projections, which the journalist had obtained through a source who had been sitting on it for 2 years, waiting for a case with a face on it. Sophia's face was on it. Within 72 hours, the story was picked up internationally. Within a week, 3 more families had contacted the newspaper with accounts of deaths from toad ceremonies in 2021 and 2022 that had never been reported publicly. ProPublica partnered with the outlet and assigned a team. The 19 deaths figure emerged from that investigation within 6 weeks, 19 confirmed, with researchers explicitly noting the number was bounded by available documentation rather than actual incidents. The DEA issued a statement announcing an expedited review of 5 MEO-DMT's scheduling status. The Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Research Center called publicly for a moratorium on unregulated ceremonial use. The Mexican Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into Centro Quetzal. Luis had left the country 11 days after Sophia's death. His current location was not known to Mexican authorities at the time of the investigation's publication. Daniel Reyes read the ProPublica story on his phone in the parking lot of a convenience store in San Antonio on a Tuesday morning in November 2023. He had been to 11 sessions total by that point. He was attending one approximately every 2 to 3 weeks. He had not held steady employment since leaving a logistics job in the spring of 2022. He was living in the same apartment, but 3 of his neighbours had complained to the building manager about the weeks when he returned from sessions and the sounds coming through the walls. Not violence, not aggression, just the specific audible texture of a person who is not doing well and is alone with it. He sat in the parking lot and read the entire story. Then he read it again. The detail that stayed with him was not the death. It was the intake form. The email from Louise saying the benzodiazepine was fine, drawn from guidance written for a different drug entirely by someone on a forum. The professional language wrapped around a dangerous gap in knowledge, the same professional language he had encountered at every facility he had ever visited, language that had felt like competence and turned out to be its costume. He thought about the form he had signed in his kitchen in San Antonio in 2017, with the pen next to the phone bill. I understand that this experience is entirely my responsibility. He thought about the 5-day SSR washout that wasn't long enough. He thought about Rodrigo's pipe in the Tijuana warehouse, and whether the compound in it was what it was supposed to be. He sat in that parking lot for a long time. Then he called his sister in Austin. She answered on the second ring. When he said her name, she said she was glad he called. She said she'd been worried. She said, and this is the detail she would repeat to the journalist 2 years later, the specific thing she remembered most clearly, that he sounded, for the first time in a long while, like himself. She was wrong, but not entirely. What she was hearing was not Daniel returning to himself. It was Daniel arriving at the particular exhaustion that precedes a decision, a specific quality of stillness that can look like recovery from the outside and feels, from the inside, like the moment before a person finally puts something down. What he did with that stillness, in the weeks that followed, would depend on things that were not yet in motion. A VA administrator in San Antonio who was about to receive a memo. A Tijuana facility that was about to receive a visit from Daniel's credit card records. And a question that had no clean answer. If the thing that had been keeping him alive, even imperfectly, even dangerously, was about to become illegal, what came next? The DEA's scheduling review moved faster than anyone in the psychedelic research community had anticipated. Pushed by the media attention, by congressional pressure from 2 senators whose constituents had died in toad ceremonies, and by the weight of 19 confirmed deaths, the agency placed 5 MEO-DMT on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act in December 2023. Schedule 1, the most restrictive classification, alongside heroin, alongside substances with, in the DEA's language, no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. The researchers at Johns Hopkins, who had been building toward the first Phase 2 clinical trial of 5 MEO-DMT for PTSD treatment, a trial that would have been the most rigorous examination of the compound's therapeutic potential ever conducted, received their trial design rejection notice on a Thursday afternoon. The compound they had been preparing to study was now Schedule 1, which meant research exemptions would take years to obtain, if they were obtainable at all. The ceremonies did not stop. Within 3 months of the scheduling, the same facilities that had been operating openly began operating differently, some moving entirely underground, removing their websites, using encrypted messaging for bookings, accepting only cash or cryptocurrency. Others relocated to jurisdictions where 5 MEO-DMT remained unscheduled: the Netherlands, Portugal, Jamaica. Several rebranded entirely as plant medicine retreats and began describing their ceremonies in terms that avoided any direct reference to the now illegal compound. The effect of scheduling was, with painful precision, the opposite of what it had been designed to achieve. The clients most at risk, those with serious psychiatric conditions, those on contraindicated medications, those who had become behaviourally dependent on the sessions, were now accessing the compound in settings with even less visibility, even less oversight, and even less possibility of medical intervention when something went wrong. The DEA had eliminated the legal middle ground. What it had not eliminated was the need. The VA program that Daniel Reyes entered in January 2024 was not designed for 5-MeO-DMT dependency. Nothing was, because the clinical category did not formally exist yet. What the program was designed for was behavioral addiction, the broader pattern in which a person organizes their life around obtaining and repeating an experience, regardless of whether that experience continues to deliver what it originally promised, regardless of the cost, regardless of the damage to the surrounding architecture of their life. The counselor who assessed Daniel on his first day, a former army medic named Roberto Fuentes who had been doing this work for 9 years, had never treated a toad venom case before. He had treated opioid dependency, alcohol dependency, gambling dependency, and 2 cases involving ketamine. He understood the underlying mechanism well enough that the specific substance was, in his clinical assessment, secondary. What he saw in Daniel on that first day was a man who had arrived at treatment not because he believed it would help, but because he had run out of other options. The sessions weren't working anymore. They were costing money he didn't have, producing 2 days of mild relief followed by a week of something worse than the baseline. He had lost the thread of what he had originally been trying to fix. The PTSD was still there, had been there the whole time underneath the sessions, waiting with its original patience. The toad had not healed it. It had interrupted it briefly, and then the interruptions had become the problem. Fuentes recorded this assessment in language that was careful and clinical. What he wrote in shorthand in his personal notes, the ones he kept in a spiral notebook rather than the electronic record, was simpler: chasing the first one. Daniel's first month in the program was the hardest. Not because of withdrawal. There was no physical withdrawal from 5-MeO-DMT, no sweating through sheets, no seizures, no physical crisis. What there was, instead, was the full unmediated weight of everything the sessions had been temporarily displacing. The nightmares returned at their original intensity within the first week, the ones involving a specific street in Kandahar province, a specific sequence of events on a specific afternoon in 2011. Events that Daniel had described to Fuentes in the kind of flat, factual language that people use when they have described something so many times it has lost its emotional texture on the surface while retaining all of it underneath. He sat through the nights in his apartment with the television on, not watching it, using the sound the way people use white noise, as something between him and the silence. Mexico, meanwhile, was attempting to regulate the wreckage. In March 2024, the Mexican Federal Health Secretariat published new requirements for retreat centers offering psychedelic-assisted experiences. The regulations mandated medical supervision by a licensed physician at all ceremonies, standardized emergency equipment including defibrillators and reversal agents, formal intake screening conducted by qualified health professionals, and registration with a newly created federal registry of alternative wellness providers. The implementation timeline was 18 months. The enforcement mechanism was complaint-based, meaning a facility could operate unregistered until someone filed a complaint, which would then be investigated by an agency with a staff of 11 people covering the entire country. The fine for operating without registration was equivalent to approximately $3,000, less than the revenue from a single weekend retreat. Within 6 months of the regulations' publication, fewer than 10% of estimated active retreat centers in Mexico had registered. The others continued operating. Some added the word compliant to their websites without having taken any compliance steps. Some simply ignored the regulations entirely, calculating correctly that the probability of enforcement was negligible. The toad population data published by Dr. Patricia Ochoa in early 2024 was the most comprehensive survey of Bufo alvarius since systematic monitoring began. It covered 47 survey sites across the Sonoran Desert in Mexico and 18 sites on the Arizona side of the border. At 31 of the 47 Mexican sites, adult toad populations had declined by more than 40% since a 2018 baseline. At 9 sites, the animals had not been detected at all. The declines were not uniform. They tracked with proximity to roads and to areas with documented human activity, which aligned with the harvest pressure hypothesis rather than a climate or disease explanation. The Arizona sites showed a different pattern. At 12 of the 18 US sites, populations appeared stable. Bufo alvarius was listed as a species of concern under Arizona state wildlife regulations. Not endangered, not protected, but flagged. The flagging had triggered monitoring. The monitoring had, in this case, produced the outcome it was designed to produce: population data that was accurate enough to be actionable. The Mexican toad had no equivalent protection. It lived in the habitat of a state government that had classified its own adverse event data to protect tourism revenue. Ochoa's 2024 paper included a projection. At current harvest pressure, localized population collapse at the most affected Sonoran sites was probable within 3 to 5 years. Not the extinction of the species. Bufo alvarius has a range that extends into areas with lower human access, and captive breeding programs existed at several zoological facilities. But the disappearance of the toad from the landscapes where it had lived for millions of years was not a worst-case scenario. It was the expected one. The response from conservation organizations was genuine but underpowered. The International Union for Conservation of Nature moved the species to a higher concern category in mid-2024. Several US-based herpetological societies launched public awareness campaigns. A sanctuary program in Sonora began working with local communities to protect specific breeding sites. None of these efforts had any mechanism for addressing the demand side of the equation, because the demand side was operating underground in encrypted channels with synthetic compound shipping from chemical suppliers in 3 different countries. The toad was almost beside the point now. The compound had escaped the animal entirely. The legitimate research continued slowly under the weight of Schedule I restrictions. Johns Hopkins received a research exemption in late 2024, 14 months after applying, and resumed work on a modified protocol using synthetic 5-MeO-DMT in a controlled clinical setting with stringent screening criteria. The initial cohort was 12 participants, 12 people, screened over 6 months in a study designed to last 2 years, attempting to characterize the therapeutic potential of a compound that had already been used by hundreds of thousands of people in uncontrolled settings. The gap between the pace of the science and the pace of the practice was not closing. It was the same gap it had always been, now formalised by a scheduling decision that made the research harder and the underground practice more dangerous, and changed nothing about the underlying reality, that there were people in genuine need of something that existing medicine had not provided, and that the toad, or the molecule the toad produced, appeared to offer something real. The something real was surrounded by everything else, and separating them required exactly the kind of rigorous, funded, longitudinal clinical research that the industry's financial incentives had suppressed and the DEA's scheduling decision had made slower. Daniel reached 3 months in the VA program in April 2024 without returning to a ceremony. Not because the urge had disappeared. Fuentes' notes from this period document it clearly. The recurring pattern of Daniel describing the sessions in the past tense, while still calculating, in some part of his attention, how difficult it would now be to find one. But the ProPublica story had done something to his internal accounting. He had read about the 19 deaths with the specific attention of someone searching for the version of the story in which he was not also a data point, and he had not found it convincingly. His sister came to San Antonio for a weekend in May. She brought her daughter, Daniel's niece, 7 years old, who had not seen him in over a year. The child climbed onto the couch beside him with the complete unself-consciousness of a person who has not yet learned to calibrate their presence around another person's damage. She sat with her leg pressed against his and watched a cartoon and explained the plot to him in a running commentary that required no response. He let her talk. He didn't move away. His VA therapist, resuming their appointments in February 2024 after a 16-month gap, noted a specific change in his presentation that she found difficult to categorize in clinical language. The hypervigilance was still present. He still positioned himself near exits, still startled at sudden sounds. The nightmares had not stopped. What had changed was something she described in her notes as a reduction in the distance between Daniel and his own experience, a quality of presence that had been absent before, as if the continuous effort of maintaining the sessions had been consuming the attention that might otherwise have been available for simply being in the room. He was in the room now, painfully, imperfectly, without the chemical shortcut he had spent 7 years trying to build into a solution. In the room. That is not a recovery. It is a beginning, which is a different thing, and understanding the difference is what makes it sustainable or not. In August 2024, the US Department of Veterans Affairs published an internal estimate, not released publicly, leaked to a journalist who published it in September, stating that 5-MeO-DMT had been used by at least 50,000 American veterans outside any clinical setting in the preceding 5 years. The methodology was conservative. The estimate was built from VA patient records cross-referenced with hospital admissions data, insurance claims, and a survey of VA counsellors asked to estimate the proportion of their current caseloads who had disclosed or were suspected of having used psychedelic compounds in ceremonial settings. 50,000. Conservative. The vast majority of those 50,000 had told their VA doctors nothing. They had crossed the border alone or in small groups, paid in cash, signed forms that released the facility from liability, and returned to their lives and their appointments and their prescriptions without disclosing any of it. Because disclosure felt like the one thing that might result in losing the one thing that had briefly, imperfectly, given them a reason to believe that the weight could be lightened. Fuentes read the leaked estimate on his lunch break and then finished his sandwich and went back to his afternoon appointments, which included Daniel Reyes at 2:30. The appointment was unremarkable. Daniel was doing the work. His progress was real and slow and non-linear, in the way that real recovery always is. Better for 3 weeks, then a bad month, then better again at a different level than before. After the appointment, Fuentes walked to the parking lot and sat in his car for a few minutes before driving home. He had been doing this work for 9 years. He had a waiting list of 43 veterans. He had a staff of 3, a budget that had been flat for 4 years, and a caseload built substantially from the wreckage of treatment gaps that had sent people across the border looking for something his department hadn't been able to offer. He sat in the car. The afternoon was hot. The parking lot was full. He drove home, go back to the tent, 8 feet wide, canvas so thin the desert stars showed through it. A man on a wool blanket, chest barely moving, lips the colour of old ash. The man beside him frozen between 2 frameworks, medical and spiritual, unable to decide which one applied, losing minutes in that gap that could not be recovered. That man was not careless. He was not a predator. He was a veteran named Thomas Carver, 51 years old, from Flagstaff, Arizona, who had learned to facilitate toad ceremonies from a weekend workshop in Sedona 8 months earlier, who genuinely believed that what he was offering was the thing that had saved his own life 2 years prior, and who had no training that would have allowed him to recognize the early signs of respiratory depression in the man lying in front of him. Thomas Carver had paid $400 for that workshop. He had a certificate. It was printed on cardstock and signed by the workshop's organizer, a man who had himself learned the practice from a YouTube series and a forum thread. The certificate said nothing about emergency medicine. It said nothing about contraindications. It said, in a font that suggested authority, that Thomas Carver was a certified Sacred Earth facilitator. Daniel Reyes had found Carver's operation through the same forum that had warned him about Trevor Adkins. The same forum, different thread. Carver's listing had 14 positive reviews. Not one of them mentioned that another participant had been hospitalized 6 weeks earlier at the same site, because that participant had asked Carver not to discuss it, and Carver, who was not malicious, had honored the request. The 11-minute gap before the paramedics arrived was not the result of anyone wanting Daniel to die. It was the result of a system with no flaw, no minimum standard, no mandatory reporting, no mechanism by which Carver's 14 positive reviews would ever share a page with the hospitalization he hadn't disclosed. The market had produced exactly what markets produce in the absence of any other organizing principle: the appearance of information and the absence of accountability. Daniel survived because his nervous system was strong enough to hold on for 11 minutes without intervention. That is the entire explanation. Not the training of the person beside him, not the protocols of the facility, not the oversight of any regulatory body. His own body buying time. He was 38 years old at the time of that night. He had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, an IED strike that killed 2 men in his unit and left him with a traumatic brain injury that was never properly diagnosed because he did not report the full extent of his symptoms at the time, because reporting them felt like the kind of weakness that got people reassigned. He had survived a decade of untreated PTSD compounded by a mild TBI that his VA records did not reflect. He had survived 5 ceremonial sessions with no proper medical screening, at least one of which had involved a synthetic compound administered without disclosure, at least one of which had caused a near respiratory failure, and all of which had been conducted by people whose qualifications existed only on their own websites. He had survived all of it. He was surviving still. In the fall of 2024, a researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, studying psychedelic-related harm, contacted Daniel through his VA counselor, asking if he would be willing to speak with her team. The researcher's name was Dr. Camille Torres, and she was building a patient registry, a systematic collection of first-person accounts from people who had used 5-MeO-DMT outside clinical settings specifically to characterize the harm profile that the published literature still could not adequately describe. The registry was the project that the suppressed Hartley data had made necessary, arrived 5 years too late, funded by a grant from a foundation that had no financial ties to the retreat industry. Torres had been trying to build this registry for 2 years. The primary obstacle was not funding and not institutional support. It was people. The people who had been harmed were not for the most part willing to identify themselves, because identification meant disclosing the ceremonies to medical providers who might alter their treatment, to employers who might draw conclusions, to family members who did not know where they'd been going on those weekends. The secrecy that had protected the industry from scrutiny was the same secrecy that made the harm invisible in the data. Daniel agreed to participate. He spent 4 hours with Torres's team over 2 sessions in October 2024, describing everything: Ensenada, Sonora, Rodrigo's warehouse, Tijuana, the Arizona tent, the dissociative recurrences, the accelerating frequency, the cracked windshield he hadn't fixed for 4 months, the night he read the ProPublica story in a convenience store parking lot. He was participant number 31 in the registry. Torres's team was aiming for 500. The number that stays, the one that belongs at the end of this story, is not 19. 19 is the floor of confirmed deaths, the number bounded by documentation rather than reality, the count that represents only the cases where someone looked and found and recorded and survived the process of trying to publish what they found. The number that stays is 50,000. 50,000 American veterans alone who used this compound outside any clinical setting, who told no one in the medical system, who signed forms releasing facilities from liability, who drove across the border or flew to the Netherlands or paid cash to a man in a converted warehouse, because the system that was supposed to help them had not helped them enough. And this was what was available, and they were desperate enough to try it, and some of them were helped, and some of them were harmed, and some of them did not come back. 50,000 is the veterans. It is not the civilians. It is not the people in Mexico and Europe and Australia and Brazil who accessed the compound in their own countries through their own underground networks. The global number of people who used 5-MeO-DMT outside clinical settings in the 5 years between 2019 and 2024 has not been calculated by any institution. The researchers who work in this space describe the task of calculating it as currently impossible, because it requires counting something that was designed to be uncountable in a regulatory environment that made visibility dangerous, in a market that had every financial incentive to keep its scale unverifiable. What is not impossible to count is what was lost. Sophia Almeida, 26, who had a co-worker who cared about her, and a mother who went on record, and a phone with a complete documentary trail of how she had tried, carefully and honestly, to find help for grief that had nowhere to go. The man in Tepoztlan who was dehydrated from the sweat lodge and sat through the evening meal with dry, cracked lips and survived that night, and has never spoken publicly about what happened to him. Thomas Carver, who stopped facilitating in January 2024 and has not left Flagstaff since, and who sent a letter to Daniel Reyes's VA address in March 2024 that Daniel's counsellor forwarded to him, a letter that Daniel read once, folded carefully, and placed in the shoebox under his bed next to the Purple Heart. The contents of the letter are not known. What is known is that Daniel did not respond to it. Dr. Albert Gruber's specimen jar, field sample 14, B, July 1965, labelled in pencil, was located by a graduate student doing archival work at the University of Arizona in 2021. The student photographed it and posted the image to an academic social media account as a piece of scientific history. The post received 43 likes, mostly from other herpetologists. Nobody in the comment thread connected it to anything happening in the present tense. The jar is still in the storage room. The venom inside it, dried to a pale residue across the inner glass after 59 years, still contains 5-MeO-DMT. The compound does not degrade. It is patient in a way that the systems built around it have not been. The ceremonies are still happening tonight, in converted rooms and rented houses and boutique retreats and tents in the desert, with natural venom and synthetic compound and everything in between, with facilitators who have emergency medicine training and facilitators who have a certificate printed on cardstock. The scheduling decision moved some of it underground. Some of it never needed to move. It was already there. The people attending these sessions include some who will be helped, and some who will be harmed, and some who are in desperate enough circumstances that the distinction feels, to them, like a secondary concern. The toad does not know any of this. It lives in the desert, those that remain, coming out after the summer rain, finding water in drainage ditches and irrigation runoff, and the shallow pools that form in rock depressions after a storm. It does not produce venom for human use. It produces venom to survive, to make itself toxic to the predators that would otherwise swallow it whole. The toad was not the crisis. The crisis was already there, in the gap between what people needed and what medicine could offer, in the suppressed data and the misaligned incentives and the desperate arithmetic of people deciding that an uncontrolled experiment was preferable to the alternative. The toad was just what filled the gap. The gap is still there. In December 2024, Daniel Reyes marked 14 months without a ceremony. He was in treatment. He was not recovered. He was working 2 days a week at a logistics company in San Antonio, the same field he had left in 2022, and on the other days he attended the VA program and saw his therapist on Thursdays, and on occasional evenings watched his niece via video call, while she explained whatever was currently requiring explanation. His hands didn't shake in the mornings anymore. The nightmares came twice a week instead of every night. A researcher at Johns Hopkins working under the Schedule I exemption on the modified clinical trial published preliminary findings in late 2024 suggesting that 5-MeO-DMT administered in a controlled medical setting with proper screening produced significant PTSD symptom reduction in 8 of 12 participants, with no serious adverse events. The finding was preliminary. The sample was 12 people. The paper called for an urgent expansion of funding to enable a Phase 2 trial. The funding had not yet been allocated. Somewhere in the Sonoran Desert, after the summer rains, a Bufo alvarius toad sat at the edge of a shallow pool. The night was warm. The air smelled of wet creosote. The toad didn't move. It had no reason to. Nobody was looking for it yet.